Hi, and welcome back to the Working Class History podcast miniseries about the Gwangju uprising of 1980. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we'd recommend going back and listening to that first. We left off last week at the end of the 19th of May, where the uprising the previous day had escalated and the South Korean military dictatorship of Chun Doo Hwan was bringing in additional police and troops to try to put an end to it once and for all. As a content note, this episode contains short but graphic descriptions of violence and sexual violence. Gwangju residents again started taking to the streets on the morning of the 20th of May, exchanging stories of state brutality and of those who had been savagely murdered. Most schools in the city were shut down, including Kim Yong Ho's. Kim's words here have been translated by Jiminy Lee and dubbed by a member of the Hun coalition.
One day, it was an ordinary day that I went to school, but without any explanation, my teacher announced, "Do not come to school until there's further notice." I didn't even have any question. All I could think about was, I can go home. I don't need to be stuck in school studying. I was so excited. So I packed up my bags with my friends. We were heading back home. Then we were like, if we ever tell our parents that we got to leave school early, they would put us in our rooms to study more anyway. Soon, we decided to hang out till late, so our parents would think that we got home around 10 p.m. after studying at school. So we all headed to the city center. It used to be around Jeollanam-do provincial office, which was the core of the May 18th Gwangju Democratic Uprising. On our way there, we met the demonstrators, and we found them very interesting. They shouted slogans like "Go away, Chun Doo Hwan." They clapped, chanted, and sang songs. There were a few songs that were familiar to me. I mean, even for a high school student like me, such as National Anthem or gospel songs from church at the time. There's a song called "I've Got Peace Like a River." Well, yeah, it's a hymn. Some people sang hymns, others sang pop songs, and they were marching while doing all of them. Because it was so much fun to watch the protesters, we felt like there was no point going to the city center. My friends and I were like, hey guys, let's just follow them. And we started to follow those people. At one point along the demonstration, there were barricades, and the tanks were rolling in. I remembered it as a tank, but later when I grew up, I realized it was an armored vehicle. But the memory of my eyes as a student, I remember it as a tank. So after the tank rumbled, the soldiers with guns stood in line in front of the tank. And I was startled. There's a tank that you could only see in a war movie. Then soldiers were blocking the front line with guns. And this was a moment of surprise and confusion. Yet the citizens were not scattered. So we were still watching it. But we were just young kids and we got nervous. We were like, hey guys, what should we do? And they said, hey, if something ever happens, we should just run away. We've discussed our meeting point. Then we ran into a certain alley. And we've been still looking around how we would go for a while. But I don't exactly remember the rest of it. After some time, all of a sudden, I heard the gun shooting repeatedly. Bang, bang, bang. At the same time, I was nervous as hell, so I ran off to our meeting point. I just ran as fast as I could. If somebody measured me for a record, I'm pretty sure that I would have run fast enough to make some kind of neighborhood record, maybe not the world record. While I was running away, I heard some citizens shout, "Come back here." But I ran off to the meeting point where I was supposed to meet my friends. When I got there, I saw some of them made it while some of them did not. There, we started to discuss again what we were going to do. Some said we should go back there to see what happened, and I agreed. So we went back to the venue. When we got there, protest was still going on. Some shouted and sat down or laid down. Because all the citizens were sitting in the area, I couldn't go any further from past the alley. But I was just watching from there, and again I could see the situation clearly because all the citizens were sitting down.
Elsewhere in the city, troops were again resorting to violence, in some places using flamethrowers to incinerate protesters. Journalists on a local newspaper went on strike, and Kim Yong Ho was still in the streets.
장갑차 앞으로 서 있던 군인들의 총이
The soldiers who were standing in front of the tanks or armored vehicles, their guns were pointing in the air. The guns then came straight down towards the front, and they began shooting. I ran away again then, but I can't remember well. Well, what I guess, based on my timid memory, the moment I ran into the alley, the citizens came at once and I might have fallen down. When I woke up and looked around, the soldiers came all the way over and assaulted the citizens. And what I remember most vividly, there were bayonets attached to their guns. Having a gun with a bayonet on it, not stabbing, but I remember soldiers were turning over some people's fallen bodies, and I think they were trying to make sure that the person in front of me was dead. At that moment, I thought I must get up and run away to survive. Well, I don't know if you ever had that kind of experience, but in that moment, my mind says that I must get up and run away. That's the only way to survive. But my body wouldn't move quickly as my will. I was just a little kid who was totally scared, and I think I raised my body a little. Then my memory goes blank.
He didn't realise it at the time, but he'd been shot in the arm. At the provincial office, then elsewhere, soldiers started to open fire on the crowds with live ammunition.
어느 가정집에서 제가 깨어났고
I woke up in some house. It is hard for me to explain everything, but yes, I woke up and saw my body was covered with the cotton blanket. And the blanket was soaked up in blood. And the smell was awful. The old lady from the house and the evacuees, they tried to stop my blood, but they did not have any first aid kits. So they ripped off the covers of the blankets. Instead of medicine, they applied the Korean seasoning called doenjang on my head. So after all that, I ended up going to the hospital after, and there I heard that I was shot. Yeah, the gunshot over my head like this. If I had raised my body a little bit more, I wouldn't have had a chance to see you right now.
By the afternoon of the 20th of May, a group of workers who'd been particularly affected by the events of the last couple of days began organising. Taxi drivers, as Kap Su Seol explains. As we discussed last time, taxi drivers frequently found themselves subjected to violence by the army as they tried to transport the wounded, with many having their cars smashed or being pulled out of their vehicles and murdered in the street.
So they are very upset with all the situation. And there's a small scare at the city stadium. That's where they have a hangout time together and they exchange trade information between shifts. And that usual hangout place become political forum during the uprising. And that they organize mass protest, what they call parade of a taxi or car parade of a taxi. And that they fill out the Gumnam Avenue. That's the biggest avenue where the major battle between military and protest took place.
Hundreds of taxi drivers assembled and prepared to try to smash through the military barricades outside the provincial office, the major government building on a large square around a fountain at the end of Gumnam Avenue. Backed up by a couple of buses, they were cheered by the protesters in the streets as they arrived, who tried to clear a way for them using steel pipes and petrol bombs.
About 200 vehicles tried to smash the cordon over the military, but it failed. Actually, military somehow managed to stop them smashing the barricade, but it turned around the situation in favor of protester back on. Finally, protester could almost breach the military barricade. And it was a very big moral booster among the protester. And that there's along the way they developed new way to attack barricades. They use vehicle as if a battery ram smash through the barricade. It was that point when protesters began to have some confidence that they could defeat military out of the city.
The sight of the taxi driver's assault started to turn the tide. Protesters started calling people into the streets, telling them to bring whatever weapons they could from home. Farmers arrived with hoes, rakes, and homemade spears, and fire engines sprayed their water at the soldiers. Other people took tactical inspiration from the taxi drivers, as Kim Yong Ho explains.
21일 날 어떤 일이 벌어졌냐면 20일부터 벌어진 상황.
So this is on the 21st. So the soldiers have guns, weapons, knives, and the civilians have nothing but their bare hands, completely outmatched. So the civilians came up with an idea: cars. They would mobilize by lines of vehicles. You place a rock on the accelerator, get out of the car, and that became the civilians' weapon. This was an overnight revelation of a means for us to push back since we didn't have any weapons. On the night of the 20th, there were gatherings of vehicles, buses, taxis, because civilians had no other weapons. It was a mess.
Paratroopers continued to kill large numbers of people, but far more kept joining them. Soon, 200,000 people were on Gumnan Avenue, and the two biggest TV broadcasters had their offices firebombed and occupied. By 9 p.m, demonstrators had seized City Hall and started burning down police stations, which continued overnight. By midnight, only the provincial hall and the train station were still in the hands of the military. The following day, there would be an all-out insurrection. On the morning of the 21st of May, the rebels found the bodies of two protesters who'd been killed at the train station. All of the rest of the dead had been taken away by the army. Around 100,000 people gathered on Gumnan Avenue and decided to requisition vehicles from the Asia Motor Factory, which made buses, military trucks and armoured vehicles. The plant was initially shut down by street protests, and the workers just stopped turning up.
Well, at the time, there was the Asia Car Company. They made vehicles for industry. They made military jeeps and trucks. There were dozens of those. And that's when the civilians broke in and brought all of those vehicles, brought them out to the cities, a civil uprising in the streets. That was the 21st of May. Shots were fired at 1 p.m. and they continued to shoot. We only heard about it through word of mouth, though. So that's when the civilians decided they needed to be armed. There was a big search for guns amongst the Korean reserve forces. But in certain zones, there were absolutely no guns to track down. In other zones, we'd search for dynamites, any weapons we can find. By 2 to 3 p.m., enough civilians found arms, guns, dynamites, any weapons we can find. And that's when the battle began.
Street vendors and poor housewives started preparing and distributing food on the streets, while the wealthy just fled the city, and the military set up checkpoints to seal off Gwangju.
On the afternoon of the 21st, the civilians finally were armed and ready to fight back. There now was a blockade around Gwangju. You could not leave, you could not enter. Some got shot and died at the new border zones from the blockade.
With no one able to drive to the city, David Dolinger decided to walk 12 miles to get in. After a pretty hairy encounter with KCIA agents, which he talks more about in the bonus episode for our Patreon supporters, he eventually arrived in Gwangju and ran into a friend.
I finally got to the edge of Gwangju. It was probably around 2. 2:30 in the afternoon. And what was funny is the same woman that I had met on the bus to Gwangju on Friday, I met as she was walking out of the city. And she turned her actually around and walked back in with me and told me everything that she had been witnessing. And at one point, as we were starting to head down this small hill that goes down the Kumon Road, which is the main street that runs right into the provincial office building, we actually saw some students that actually had a body of a dead individual, and they were using this to show the citizens in the neighborhood what was being done and how brutal the troops had been, because this young man had been beaten to death. And when he had finished sort of telling the neighborhood about it, he actually came over and talked to me about it and said, "We can't stand for this. This is not right." We continued our walk down towards the center of town. The next thing I knew, I actually heard helicopters. And, I'm looking up at the sky, looking for where the helicopter might be to try to figure out what's going on. I didn't notice everyone else had left the street. And then all of a sudden, I just heard people yelling at me. And finally, the woman I was with ran out, grabbed me by the arm, and dragged me into the store. And was like, "What, are you stupid?" I'm like, what's wrong? And the next thing I knew, I understood why, because I started to hear the sound of gunfire. They were actually shooting out of the helicopters at any mass of people that were collected on the streets. And this is what she then told me. They had been shooting people most of that day from the helicopters. So I needed to be careful if I heard a helicopter coming, make sure I took cover. With that, we finally went all our way down to downtown. We're able to go under the main street, so under Kumon Road. And we parted company while I went to see if Kim was living. And unfortunately, at that point in time, Kim wasn't. He had actually gone out of Gwangju to work. But the family he lived with actually said, "Don't worry, he's coming back today." So I left my one bag there and took my camera, and we went back to Kim Yong Ho to see what was going on. And on the side streets were where the citizens were all taking refuge. And I sort of figured out why with that in another brilliant move, because I'm talking to people, they're trying to find out who I am. When they find out that I'm not a journalist, that I'm a Peace Corps volunteer, but I do speak Korean, which is okay. They're like, "Oh, okay, fine." They were trying to find Western journalists that they could actually talk to. But as I went to the sort of the end of the side street, I started to poke my head around to see what was going on down in front of the provincial office building. The next thing I know, I'm jerked back, and I'm looking at this young Korean man, and he's just sort of shaking his head. Again, it's another, "Are you stupid?" I'm like, "What? What's wrong?" He's like, "They're shooting anyone that sticks their head out. They're shooting them." He's like, "We've already had a few people that have gone, poked their heads around the corner to try to see what was going on."
More and more people kept attacking the military barricade on Gumnan Avenue and were being shot down like flies by machine gun fire from the provincial office and helicopters overhead. Several people launched vehicle attacks on the barricade, many of whom were shot and killed. David witnessed the horrific violence firsthand.
Some of the initial things that we saw were in the Christian hospital, where we actually saw bodies of people that had been shot from helicopters. And to me, that was just unthinkable, that you could see a bullet enter in a person's left shoulder and exit down by their right hip. And then we actually had doctors, I had doctors show me the x-rays. They weren't using regular bullets. They were using what we always referred to as dum-dum bullets, the tumblers. And they would just create this path of destruction through the body. You know, everything on the outside was two holes. But inside, the entire body was torn apart. Then to follow that up with bodies that you know that their loved ones couldn't even recognize them. I mean, I saw people whose facial features weren't correct. You know, the jaw is not supposed to be over on the left side of the face. You know, you couldn't even tell that it was a human face. You just knew that parents and loved ones could never recognize this person. You know, we saw women that had had their stomachs split open. And in that one case, one of the people that was telling me about it said she was pregnant. We don't know where the fetus went. You know, we saw women that had their breasts cut off. That's the kind of violence and brutality that occurred there. I mean, it's all you can say is that it was inhuman what was being done.
Residents in Gwangju were completely horrified and enraged by what they were seeing. Many people flocked to overcrowded hospitals to donate blood.
Gwangju is like a traffic hub of the area, and like many other traffic hubs, it has a very oversized red light district. And the sex workers are the first non-student people who joined the protest. They also donate blood in drop, although doctors at first turned them away because they worry about STDs. Some of them clean body of the victim before being seen by the family. Why they joined the uprising or how they organize are entirely unknown. They just vanished because after uprising, because of a bias associated with their sex work in Korea. And it seems that military retaliate against them. I saw some years ago there were unconfirmed record that paramilitary raid a red light district nearby bus terminal. I don't know what they mean by raid or 습격. It does not mean mass roundup because there's no record of a mass detention of a sex worker during the uprising or after uprising. I don't want to speculate, but it's scary what 습격 could mean or raid could mean in that context.
Eventually, the doctors agreed and began taking blood donations from sex workers to help keep the wounded alive. Back in the streets, rebels started distributing rifles they'd seized from military reserve armories. In South Korea, military service is compulsory for all men, and there are military reserve forces around the country. The rebels gave out 30 carbine rifles with a single clip of ammunition to a group who became the first citizens' militia of the uprising. They promptly set up in buildings around the provincial hall and began firing on it through the windows. Coal miners provided dynamite and detonators for the rebels, and women textile workers seized hundreds of rifles and handguns after raiding 3 police stations. Elsewhere, people seized TNT, hand grenades, ammunition, rifles, and a small number of machine guns. Some armed demonstrators began attacking Province Hall right away, while others, many of them in their reserve army uniforms, assembled in Gwangju Park and formed combat units. Some of them were construction workers, waiters, shoe shiners, and some wanted revenge for murdered family members.
걸기대를 하면서 함께 이렇게
Those who were able to help and fight were asked to stay. Dozens of men showed up at a time to lend a hand and join the civilian army. Women also showed up to assist.
The hastily formed militia headed to Province Hall and at 5 p.m. set up machine guns on the roof of a hospital overlooking it. Half an hour later, overwhelmed, the paratroopers fled. They drove away in armoured vehicles and trucks, essentially shooting their way out through the crowds, killing several unarmed civilians, as well as some local residents in their homes. Some militia gathered all the equipment that had been abandoned, including thousands more rifles and handguns, while others pursued the retreating paratroopers into the mountains. More government soldiers were called in from outside, some of whom accidentally attacked the fleeing paratroopers, killing at least 30. By 8 p.m, the paratroopers had been driven from the city. Gwangju had been liberated by its residents.
I think military response to initial protests, there's nothing special about that. It was brutal, it was violent, as they did in many cases, many incidents before Gwangju. They simply beat people into silence and terrorize them, and everything going back to business as usual. That's usually happen in the South Korean demonstration scene up until Gwangju. But they continue to escalate their violence. They first beat, then stab, and then shot people to death. But usually, in face of that kind of that level of violence, people just go home. They remain quiet. But Gwangju was different. People fought back with their bare hand, danced on and anything they can put hand on, such as wood stave, steel pipe, firebomb, and eventually they raided the armory and captured the firearm to fight back. But I don't think it's people's violence that defeat military. It was a sheer number. At some point, about 400,000 people out in the street fought against paratrooper. That's more than half of the entire civil population in Gwangju. So it was a sheer number of the people that forced military out of the city.
They were celebrating in the streets, but at the same time the militia set about preparing to defend the city. The military then set about ensuring that Gwangju was surrounded and sealed off from the outside world.
승리하리라고 생각 못했죠.
No, it wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like a victory. For it to be a victory, we would have had to see all of Seoul, all of Korea rise up. But the army closed off the Jansun zone. This was the pathway to Seoul. And we were afraid to head to Seoul because of the blockades there.
The next morning, the 22nd of May, Gwangju residents set about cleaning up the city, much of which had effectively been a war zone. David Dolinger was there with a couple of other Peace Corps volunteers. One of them was a guy called Tim. They had all refused to leave the city, in defiance of orders from the US Embassy.
Yeah, so once the citizens took control of the city, groups were organized to start cleaning up. Immediately on Thursday morning, people started to clean all the debris that had been there, the previous day from the protests that had occurred and the demonstrations that had occurred right in front of the provincial office buildings. So the citizens, wanted to, in a lot of ways, take everything back and make it normal again. We walked around the city considerably and saw no real evidence of any vandalism that had occurred. We did see one of the big, metal sliding doors that protects the fronts of stores that looked like it had been hit by a car, but that was it. Otherwise, people were going about, sweeping up the streets, collecting the debris. They were towing away the buses and trucks that had been destroyed the previous days. So the citizens really wanted to take back their city. And as a foreigner, the love that came out of them when they saw us, it was amazing because they all wanted to talk to us. They all wanted to tell us what had gone on, why this had to happen. And they wanted to make sure that we could help get that information out. So, one of the things that Tim and I and the others did during the rest of our time there was actually translate for foreign reporters who were able to get into the city. Because most of them had either come with no Koreans to help translate, or they didn't trust the Koreans that they were with. A number of them told us flat out, we know our Korean translators work for the KCIA, so we can't trust anything that they're telling us. So could you please either confirm what they translate for us or do the actual translation for us? Yeah, they always tried to paint things in a sort of a better light than the way I would have translated. Now, I can't say that, that I would ever claim to be a translator. But with, to me, they were taking liberties with the translations that they were doing.
With no police, no army, and pretty much everything shut down, the workers and residents of Gwangju started to organize themselves to reopen the city. Some people refer to this period as the Gwangju Commune, drawing parallels between it and the Paris Commune, where the workers of Paris and mutinous National Guardsmen took over the city in 1871 and set about reorganizing it in the interests of the working class. Although at least one key difference would be that while the Paris Commune was a specifically working class and socialistic uprising, calling into question property rights and capitalism itself, that in Gwangju was more narrowly focused on achieving democratic and workers' rights. As an example of a city being self-managed, to me it's more reminiscent of events like the Seattle General Strike in 1919, when striking workers took over the city and ran essential services themselves.
The day after I was shot, they say that's when soldiers withdrew from the provincial office. Since then, citizens took control of Gwangju, the provincial government as a command center. Citizens controlled everything by themselves, and I was in that very scene.
Market merchant and vendor began to organize communal kitchen to feed people and feed the protester. College student and labor union controlled the traffic and organized the funeral. But what's very interesting is that all these already existing organizations took up new role during the uprising. Even some city workers cooperated with them to dole rice and keep city bus operating throughout the 5 years period.
So most shops weren't open, but the markets. So they have open air markets where they did, sold a lot of the vegetables, the staples. Those were open, and at least until Sunday, they really weren't any limits to food at all. And what was really beautiful about some of what occurred is because the people knew that this group of mainly students or young, working people were in essence protecting the city. They would make rice balls in just massive numbers to be able to feed them, so that they didn't have to worry about food. So I was constantly being handled these rice balls because everyone was wanting to make sure that you were maintaining your strength. Because one of the things that I ended up doing personally was spending a lot of time in the actual provincial office building. So that was the headquarters for where the citizens who were running the city at that point in time and negotiating with the military had set up their headquarters. So I was lucky enough to be able to get a pass that allowed me to freely go in and out. And I was actually the only foreigner that actually had that pass.
그때 당시 광주도 여느 도시와 똑같이
Gwangju at the time was also one of the cities where robbery, theft, and this kind of crime happened on a daily basis. Surprisingly, there were a lot of weapons in Gwangju during that time. Even though there were a variety of weapons that anyone could easily acquire, on the other hand, there were no robberies, no thefts, not a single crime. I've seen many examples of international struggles or protests, but I think this seems to be one of the characteristics of the Gwangju uprising. For example, my house was located near a farm in Jisan-dong, about 2 kilometers away from the provincial office building. People cooked rice and drew water, and when the civilian army and their trucks were passing by the road, we were living around. The residents would put rice and water onto the truck, and that's the one I remember.
During the day, there was a lot of people running around, but they were trying to organize. They had different groups that were involved with all different things, whether it was cleaning up the city, maintaining the barricades, and making sure that there were people out in the barricades.
그 도청 현장에서 제가 주로 있었던 건 상무관인데.
Where I usually stayed at the provincial office, it was called the commercial department. When corpses were loaded in there, They laid the bodies in state temporarily. Yes, I remember that what happened there, I mean, they were ordinary citizens who were not trained at all, but there was an amazing sequence of every process. Rather than a memory of chaos, as ordinary people may imagine an agonizing scene, the situation of the provincial office I was in, it was not like that at all. Considering those, I think the emotions of the people of Gwangju and what I went through, the resistance to violence and the sympathy that we must unite and fight against that, I think that was the power that made us govern ourselves.
The so-called forces of order who had brought chaos and bloodshed to Gwangju had been driven from the city, and the workers and residents established actual order. The city was cleaned up, essential services were up and running, women in particular helped ensure that everyone was fed, and the hospital blood supplies were maintained. The militia set up patrols to maintain order and defend the city, and the provincial office was established as the headquarters of the rebellion to coordinate events and begin negotiations with the government. As we'll see, divisions among the rebels would soon start to emerge, and a few days later, government forces would re-enter the city and take their revenge. Our Patreon supporters can listen to this now, and for everyone else, Part 3 will be out next week. Our Patreon supporters can listen to all parts of this miniseries plus an exclusive bonus episode now. Supporters can also get other great exclusive benefits. Learn more about this and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. For everyone else, future parts will be out each week. As always, we've got more information, sources, photos, and transcripts on the webpage for this episode. Link in the show notes. We've also made extensive use of the book Kap translated, Gwangju Diary, as a source for this episode. Link to buy it or read it online in the show notes. We'd like to thank all of our guests for speaking with us, as well as Michael Choi for undertaking interviews in Gwangju, and Angela Lee, Jiminy Lee, and the Hun Coalition who helped with translation and dubbing. Huge thanks to our Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible. Special thanks to Connor Kanatsi, Shay, James, and Ariel Joya. If you're unable to support us financially on Patreon right now, please do tell your friends and colleagues about our podcast and share links to it on your social media pages. Theme music for this episode was Marching for the Beloved, about the Gwangju uprising, by Baek Ki-won, Hwang Suk-young, and Kim Jong-ryul. Link to stream it in the show notes. Thanks to Jesse French for editing this episode. And finally, thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.